Was stricken just last Monday and is now in the hospital, so is not able to be here this morning. Wish to read a letter that the Cardinal sent to Father Coughlin. Dear Father Charlie, I regret very much to tell you that I cannot be with you on Thursday, June 9th, for the observance of your Golden Jubilee. I have been fighting an infection for several days and now have a very high fever. My physician has directed me to enter St. Elizabeth's Hospital for a checkup that is long overdue. Enclosed herewith is a copy of my address, and if you wish to have someone read it, it is perfectly agreeable with me. Sorry, very sorry, that I cannot join in your celebration. I had looked forward with great pleasure to taking part in the happy event. Please keep me in your prayers. I assure you of a faithful remembrance in mind. Wishing you every blessing, I am devotedly yours, Richard Cardinal Cushing, Archbishop of Boston. Cardinal Cushing has sent as his personal representative Right Reverend Monsignor Francis J. Lally of the Archdiocese, the editor of the Boston Pilot, to read the text of the Cardinal's message.
Reverend Archbishop, Reverend Jubilarian, Reverend Bishop, clergy, sisters, and friends in Jesus Christ. His Eminence Cardinal Cushing has asked me to express to you his very special regret at being unable to be present for the celebrations this morning. For many months he'd planned to be present, postponing hospitalization for this reason, in order to be with Father Coughlin on this day. However, he entered the hospital, as you heard, just a week ago, and continues to be under care there. While we offer our prayers this morning in a very special way for Father Coughlin on his anniversary, let us also add a prayer for the speedy recovery of the Archbishop of Boston. One black night, 40 years ago, the Ku Klux Klan burned a flaming cross on the lawn of a little parish in Michigan. At that time, almost no one would have known the name of the Little Flower Parish, and very few in America had ever heard of Royal Oak. A half dozen years later, Father Charles E. Coughlin had made both of these names bywords in the American home, and he had himself skyrocketed to fame and influence in the process. We should recall that those years were the deepest of the Great Depression of the 30s, when penury and despair stalked the streets of our nation, and when prosperity was just around the corner. It was a long time, however, before the corner was turned, and in the meantime, Americans anxiously sought some solution to their woes, as a sluggish economy was slowly being revived by what seemed to be, at the time, trial and error experiments. Among the many voices raised in those days, one was the eloquent and persuasive call of a young priest whose heart burned with the sufferings of the poor, a priest who refused to be satisfied with want in the midst of plenty and misery in the midst of wealth. It has been said that Father Coughlin was the first person to make the word encyclical a familiar one to Americans, and it is surely a fact that no one preached the social doctrine of the Church with greater insistence and endurance. Week after week, year after year, American radio listeners heard of the dignity of labor and the working man, the living wage, the rights of organized labor, the importance of private property, the responsibility of government in social justice, and the claims of the good society on all its citizens. During those critical years when so many were blinded to its true reality, they were reminded, too, of the dangers of communism and the international conspiracy it represents. We can say fairly that many Americans learned for the first time the true nature of atheistic totalitarianism from the radio priest of Royal Oak. Needless to say, the strength and the courage that marked the broadcast from the shrine of the Little Flower made enemies in high places and in low. Few public figures in our national history were so consistently vilified, investigated, persecuted, and denounced as was Father Coughlin. Through it all, the golden voice went on pleading for economic reform, rallying support for legislation, preaching social justice, and defending the place of the working man in the American dream. There were from time to time, to be sure, excesses in oratorical expression, errors in judgment brought on by the heat of conflict with limited resources, and certain rhetorical simplifications of complex economic questions. Father Coughlin was a truly controversial figure within the church as well as outside of it. But in all of this, never was there even a hint of worldly ambition or greed, never a capitulation to popularity, only the drive always to serve America and the best interests of all her people. As we look back with the hindsight of history, there are some things that could have been done differently if one had been permitted to see the total picture. We are, however, always in the midst of events in which we must act. We must decide upon the perspective of each moment or give ourselves over to inaction. Father Coughlin has said in one of his rare later interviews that he would not do quite the same if he were acting now. But is this not true of all of us who look back upon a busy life in which decisions simply could not wait? The truly significant thing is that in a time which desperately cried out for action, a man of leadership awakened a stricken America and assisted in making it conscious of its own great potential. If the call was, on occasion, strident or unclear, it was most often a voice of strength in a time of weakness and a voice of hope in a generation close to despair. I would like to suggest this morning that we use the opportunity of this precious Jubilee to remind ourselves of the lessons that come to us out of the life and career, the courage and the constancy of this exceptional man. The priest in our day is being reminded again and again of the importance of his social concerns. The decrees of Vatican Council II have emphasized the importance of making our own the problems of the people of God, of involving ourselves as Christian witnesses in events which are called secular, of bringing the city of God into confrontation with the city of man. Only a few weeks ago, Pope Paul addressed himself to this subject. The Church, the Pope said, has made its own the principle of the progress of social justice. That is to say, of the necessity of promoting and implementing the common good, not only by its speculative doctrine, but also by its practical teaching. The promotion of the common good involves reforming existing legal norms whenever they do not take into sufficient account the just distribution of the advantages and burdens of life in society. And the Pope went on to say, the Church has never been afraid to descend from the religious sphere proper to it to the sphere of the concrete conditions of social life. Like the Samaritan in the Gospel, the Church has descended from its purely religious concerns for the cult of worship, and it has become a minister of charity, not only individual charity, but social charity. It has shown its concern in the economic field. It has spoken of the relationship between capital and labor. It has pronounced on the labor contract, on wages, assistance, family allowances, private property and savings, on 100 practical questions essentially connected with the honest and legitimate necessities of life. So far the words of Pope Paul. These words are intended to encourage the priest in our day to be involved in the changing world about him, to put the mark of Christ on the times in which he lives, to transform the world in the spirit of the gospel. Certainly we can acknowledge today the number of priests in the United States who were seriously involved in the study of social problems 30 years ago was very small. It was a time for pioneering in social action, and one of the sturdiest of our pioneers was today's Jubilarian. His summons to social justice was so broad that it went far beyond the bounds of his own communion and embraced all those who sought the betterment of men and society. In those hardy, pre-ecumenical days, it is difficult now to appreciate the number of hazards that a social reformer, who was also a priest, was bound to encounter. The special interests, the exploiters, the privileged, these were formidable opponents then as they are even today. They could not, however, stand out against the millions, literally millions of Americans who had been persuaded by the radio priests that a better world was possible, a world in which the workman would give honest work for honest wages, in which the fruits of the earth would be at the use of man, in which families could raise their children in honor and dignity, in which wealth was not the luxury of the few, but the comfort of the many. No one has ever suggested that those who seek social reform will always achieve it in their own way. Usually large social changes are the work of many forces, and each one of us can only make his contribution to what is a wide pattern of transformation. We cannot take the measure of a man's success by measuring programs and arranging social statistics. A better measure can often be his own involvement in social action and the number of people whom he made attentive to social realities. If ever we must say that a man was a man of his own time, we must say this of Father Coughlin. No other time in our history could have produced him or registered his success. And yet, in another sense, he was a man decades ahead of his time. Before clergy marched for the disenfranchised and the dispossessed, he marched. Before priests and pastors lobbied openly for remedial social legislation, he besieged the Congress with the voice of the people. Before preachers pleaded for peace, he sought vainly to keep us from war. We hear a great deal today about the committed priest. I submit that our Jubilarian had made his commitment to the poor of America long before anti-poverty became the popular word of the social planners. He was a priest committed to a better social order, committed to a world of justice, committed to a new deal when it meant a better deal, committed to a life worthy of man as a child of God. In this sense, he was the giant of his generation among the committed priests of America. By the end of the 30s, the face of the world was changing, and the clouds that gathered on the horizon of those years were about to darken the lives and muffle the hopes of a whole generation of men. And then there was Pearl Harbor. As America turned its attention toward the defense of freedom in so many parts of the world, the problems of social justice at home took second place to the successful prosecution of a war that would, it was hoped, end all wars. A nation united not merely in heart and mind, but one also involved in a single action, had very little place for any effort which could dissipate its solidarity of purpose in a war which could mean the end of civilization itself. Social reforms would have to wait until the task at hand was first dispatched. Father Coughlin, like every other loyal American, made his sacrifice. He left the airwaves. For the next 25 years, he was simply the pastor of Royal Oak. Today, on the eve of that moment when he lays down his pastoral burden, we can begin to appreciate something of what this change must have meant for him. Something of the discipline of silence which he himself imposed upon America's most famous priestly voice. A generation that finds it hard to understand the claims of obedience upon the will of man can never comprehend an action of this kind. They will be satisfied to interpret it in terms of disappointment, disillusionment, or frustration, as if some transformation of the human character suddenly turned the man of action into the man of repose. Nothing could be further from the fact. Father Coughlin has always been an obedient priest. His career had been encouraged by his bishop from the very beginning. He had been given a broad freedom in which to exercise his exceptional talent. Even in his most popular days, and also in the midst of his sometimes unpopular ventures, he had never been unfaithful to the promise of obedience he had made on the very first day of his ordination. Obedience, especially to the independent mind, is never easy, but practice makes it possible even in the midst of trying circumstances. For Father Coughlin, it was the practice of a lifetime, the discipline of all his priestly years, that assisted the change from radio orator to parish priest. And the decision once made saw no turning back. Half measures or begrudging assent had no place in his character. I would like to suggest that here, too, Father Coughlin was a man ahead of his time, perhaps even a bit ahead of our own time. Obedience in the church is not discussed now in terms simply of authority and those subject to authority, nor in terms of those who give orders and those who accept them. It is interpreted today more profoundly, perhaps more realistically, in terms of service. The Pope himself, in whom the highest authority rests in Christ's church, is traditionally described as the servus servorum Dei, the servant of the servants of God. And the Lord himself, in whom all power is given in heaven and on earth, is extolled in the Scriptures as the suffering servant. Service is very nearly our highest Christian title. Each one of us is at the service of another, and all of us at the service of God. Those in authority serve in one way, those subject to authority in another, but it is the same service. Obedience is our commitment to service, and we obey, not blindly, not unthinking, not by force, but better to place ourselves at the service of others. It was with this disposition that Father Coughlin came back to give his full talent to the people of Royal Oak. He who had served the people of America in the wide apostolate of social justice now saw his place in pastoral service at his parish church, and the ways of a lifetime continue. Only a few days ago, he announced that he would become a pastor emeritus of this former parish. Why? Because he saw, as the years have passed, that his people would be better served by his retirement. The loyal, obedient servant cannot cease to be what he has always been. I would leave it to others to pass judgment on the many technical questions which Father Coughlin discussed in his radio talk. Economic theory, monetary reform, social planning, all of these require an expertise to which I lay no claim. I do have, however, a strong personal recollection of certain radio addresses which the passing of the years has not dimmed. On those Sunday afternoons, you will remember, closest to the great Christian feast, Father Coughlin was accustomed to set aside his more secular preoccupations and reflect with his audience on the mysteries of our holy faith. Seldom has the gospel been preached with such eloquence. Seldom have we heard the truths of religion expounded with more felicity of phrase and power of exhortation. Surely not the least of our jubilarian contributions to the strength of America were those hours of spiritual reflection when millions of our citizens turned their thoughts to the Magnalia Dei, the wonderful things of God. It is not just as a reformer that Father Coughlin should be best remembered among us. It is as a priest who took seriously his responsibility to preach the gospel and whose golden voice was never more persuasive than when it spoke of the sacred and the divine. It is significant today that we gather on this anniversary not to commemorate his first broadcast or his last one, not to recall his victories or his defeats, but to look back in joy upon that day 5 decades past when he came for the first time as a priest to the altar of God. He could not know what days he answered for that day. Giving the bud, he gave the flower. Thoughts yet unripe in him, he bent one way. He pledged his fields while spring was gray. No one could have guessed then what paths lay ahead, what hills there were that must be climbed, what challenges that must be met, what tasks that would not wait. But he began a priest's work, and it is only today, as the years demand it, that he gently lays down what he once so bravely embraced. Let others at other times speak of the orator, the organizer, the reformer. On this day, we salute the priest. And how proper it is that we should be gathered here at the shrine of the little flower which Father Coughlin himself erected, which has been the center of his life for 40 years. Here he is, the simple priest, moving among his people. Here he offers sacrifice. Here he forgives and consoles. Here he teaches and comforts. Here he makes the gospel live in the lives of those entrusted to his care. Around this shrine, he has made Christ present to his flock. And he has seen one generation give place to another as the people of God move on towards salvation. In this priestly context, he is honored today among those he has served. They who know him best and love him most bring their tribute to his Jubilee. Is it too much to see something fitting in the very name of Royal Oak? When Father Coughlin first came here as a youthful pastor, he began his radio career in order to build a suitable edifice for the worship of God. Like the young oak, he was strong and full of promise. He could move with every wind and stay firm in purpose. And as the years passed, the growing tree knew every climate and change of weather. He drew vigor from the days of sunshine and the nourishing rain. In cold and storm, he held his head high and stood out against the elements. For all his years, he drew from this soil those elements that would provide endurance. And in his protection, there would always be shelter. For most Americans, Royal Oak is a man as well as a place. And this doubtless is as it should be. So on this day, and in this place, let our hearts swell and our voices proclaim the name of Father Charles E. Coughlin, the truly Royal Oak of his generation. May the God who guided him through many years in times past be at his side in all the days that are ahead. Ad multos amen. In the name of the Father and the Son